What if a pivotal early Christian movement, once vibrant and influential, was systematically erased from historical memory, its story deliberately obscured? This report delves into the compelling enigma of the Bardaisanites, a Gnostic sect founded by Bardisan of Edessa in the 2nd to 3rd century CE. This group's beliefs represented a fascinating blend of early Christianity with elements of astrology and potentially other Eastern philosophies. Despite their historical significance, the Bardaisanites remain largely unknown outside of specialized academic circles, a situation reflected in their virtually no documentary presence on major video platforms. The pronounced scarcity of direct information regarding the Bardaisanites is not an accidental oversight in the historical record. Instead, it reflects a deliberate process of historical revision and suppression. As the proto-orthodox Christian communities solidified their doctrinal positions, they actively sought to marginalize and eradicate dissenting voices. Historical accounts confirm that the nascent Catholic and various Orthodox churches undertook a concerted effort to harass Gnostic Christians, repress their movements, and systematically destroy their literature. This proactive suppression means that any information available today often originates from the writings of their theological adversaries, known as patristic polemics, or from modern academic reconstructions that attempt to navigate these biased sources. Consequently, understanding the Bardaisanites necessitates a critical evaluation of the surviving accounts, acknowledging that the historical narrative was largely shaped by the victors of early Christian theological debates. Furthermore, it is crucial to recognize that the early Christian landscape was far from monolithic. In the 2nd century, there was no dominant form of Christianity in regions like Edessa or other urban centers. This historical context indicates that Bardaisan's teachings were not merely deviations from a universally accepted orthodoxy, but rather represented alternative interpretations within a highly fluid, diverse, and intensely contested theological environment. His heresies were often sophisticated attempts to articulate Christian belief in new ways, competing with other emerging ideologies for adherence and theological supremacy, rather than simple aberrations from an already established norm. By carefully piecing together fragmented evidence and reinterpreting these often biased accounts, it becomes possible to reconstruct a more nuanced and compelling picture of this forgotten yet significant religious movement. Bardaisan, the enigmatic sage of Edessa. At the heart of the Bardaisanite movement was its founder, Bardaisan, also known as Bardaisan or Bardaisanes, a figure of remarkable intellectual breadth and influence. Born on July 11, 154 CE, in Edessa, Syria, Bardaisan was a polymath of his era, recognized as a scholar, astrologer, philosopher, hymn writer, and poet. His literary contributions were particularly noteworthy, especially his Syriac hymns, which gained immense popularity and were sung for generations, earning him renown in Syriac poetry and music. He also wrote dialogues against Marcion and Valentinus, astrological treatises, and a Book of the Laws of the Countries, a lost work, Account of India, based on interviews with Indian Shramana's ascetics, ambassadors to Emperor Elagabalus, revealed his knowledge of Indian religions. Bardaisan's journey into Christianity began with his conversion in 179 CE, reportedly after he heard the homilies of Hystaspes, the bishop of Edessa. He emerged as a pioneer of the Christian faith in Syria, playing a significant role in the Christianization of Edessa. Historical accounts suggest that he may have converted King Abgar IX to Christianity, potentially contributing to the establishment of what some consider the first Christian state. This level of influence underscores his prominent standing within the religious and political landscape of his time. The most invaluable, almost first-hand source for understanding Bardaisan's thought is the Book of the Laws of the Countries, BLC, also known as the Dialogue of Destiny or Against Fate. Although this work was penned by his disciple Philip, it is widely considered to be a faithful reproduction of Bardaisan's views, providing a reliable window into his philosophical and theological system. The BLC is structured as a dialogue, primarily exploring profound questions concerning nature, fate, and human free will. It also contains extensive ethnographic observations, reflecting Bardaisan's broad knowledge of various cultures and traditions. Bardaisan's intellectual formation and theological development position him as a pivotal bridge figure in the intellectual history of late antiquity. Born in Edessa, a city predominantly pagan in his day, he was educated in Babylonian astrology and was renowned for his knowledge of India. His writings also included polemics against other prominent contemporary Christian movements, such as those of Marcion and Valentinus. The BLC itself is described as reflecting the various cultures and the intellectual climate of northern Mesopotamia. This background illustrates that Bardaisan was not merely a Christian theologian in isolation, but a product of a deeply syncretic, intellectually vibrant, and multicultural environment. His theological system represents a sophisticated attempt to integrate diverse philosophical and religious currents, making him a crucial figure for understanding the intellectual ferment and cross-pollination of ideas during this period. The reliance on the Book of the Laws of the Countries as the primary source for Bardaisan's ideas, given that almost all his other works have perished, presents a significant challenge for historical reconstruction. While the BLC is considered a faithful representation of his views, its indirect authorship by his student Philip means that scholars are always interpreting Bardaisan's thought through a mediated lens. This inherent limitation necessitates careful academic scrutiny and adds a layer of investigative complexity to understanding his true doctrines, transforming the study of Bardaisan into a form of historical detective work. A cosmic tapestry, Bardaisanite beliefs. The theological system of Bardaisan and his followers presented a distinct vision of the cosmos, human existence, and salvation, diverging significantly from what would become mainstream Christian doctrine. The world's flawed genesis. Bardaisan's cosmology posited a world that began with four pure and uncreated elements: light, wind, fire, and water, each occupying its own region. By chance, these elements exceeded their boundaries and began to mix, and primordial darkness, taking advantage of this opportune moment, also intermingled with them. Distressed, the elements appealed to God, whom Bardaisan referred to as the Father of the living. God used this chaotic mixture to create the world, but the remaining darkness within the mixture became the persistent source of evil. This world, created from a flawed genesis, is considered temporary, allotted a period of 6,000 years, after which a definitive purification will occur, expunging darkness and evil from existence. Bardaisan is also considered by some scholars, such as Ilaria Ramelli, to be one of the earliest Christian proponents of apokatastasis, or universal restoration, believing that eventually all evil movements will cease, all rebellions will come to an end, and there will be safety and peace as a gift of the Lord of all natures. This view contrasts with the mainstream Christian doctrine of creation, ex nihilo, from nothing, by God, and the concept of eternal damnation. Freedom, fate, and the stars. A central concern of Bardaisan's thought was anthropological, focusing on the precise interplay between nature, fate, and human free will. He developed a unique synthesis that affirmed the influence of all three on human beings. Bardaisan strongly emphasized human free will as a divine gift, distinguishing humans and angels from other creations. This free will served as the fundamental basis of moral responsibility, enabling individuals to choose good actions and avoid evil ones. He differentiated human free will from the physical nature of human beings, which governs biological processes like birth, growth, and aging, traits shared with animals. Bardaisan acknowledged the concept of fate, particularly through the lens of astrology, a practice he himself engaged in at one point. He held that the sun, moon, and planets were living beings, entrusted by God with the governance of this world, and that humans were strongly influenced by the constellations for good or evil. However, he explicitly limited the scope of fate, subordinating it to God's ultimate power and distinguishing its influence from the immutable laws of physical nature. A key argument in the Book of the Laws of the Countries is that human laws and customs, often referred to as customs of the nations, demonstrate the overriding power of free will. Bardaisan observed that people born under different astrological influences still adhere to the same national customs, implying that human choice and societal norms can counteract astral determination. Mainstream Christianity generally rejected astral fatalism, emphasizing divine providence and human free will as primary determinants. The nature of Christ and resurrection. Bardaisan's Christology is a complex subject, often described as a variety of Valentinianism, a prominent form of Gnosticism. However, it is important to note that Bardaisan actively wrote against Valentinus, indicating a nuanced relationship rather than simple adherence. He believed in an almighty God, the creator of heaven and earth, to whom all things are subject. His understanding of Christ leaned towards docetism, the belief that Christ only appeared to have a physical body, or that his body was spiritual rather than material. Some of his followers, such as Marinus, explicitly denied Christ's birth from a woman. Bardaisan viewed Christ primarily as the Word of Thought, who created the world and functioned predominantly as a teacher and lawgiver. This contrasts with the mainstream Christian belief in the full incarnation of God in Christ, with both divine and human nature, truly born, lived, and suffered. A major point of contention between Bardaisanites and emerging orthodoxy was the doctrine of the resurrection of the body. While Bardaisan is commonly described as denying the physical resurrection of the body, scholarly opinion reveals a more nuanced position. Bardaisan himself affirmed the resurrection, but he believed it to be a transformation from a corruptible body into a body created from pure matter without any mixture with darkness. His anthropology located personhood primarily in the human soul, arguing that only the soul would rise, as the physical body was a secondary constituent destined to turn to its dust. He supported this view with scriptural arguments, interpreting death in certain biblical passages as the death of the soul rather than the physical body. Mainstream Christian doctrine emphasizes the bodily resurrection of the dead, though the specific nature of the resurrected body has been debated. Echoes from the East, Syncretism. Bardaisan's thought stands as a prominent example of religious syncretism, particularly his blending of early Christianity with Babylonian astrology. He was, in essence, a Christian astrologer. While the user query mentions Hindu Buddhism, it is important to clarify that the provided research material does not explicitly detail a direct doctrinal blend of Bardaisan's teachings with Hindu Buddhism. However, the evidence strongly confirms his extensive knowledge of India. He wrote a lost work titled Account of India and interviewed Indian religious figures, specifically Shramanas, wandering ascetics, who were ambassadors to the Roman Emperor Elagabalus. He was aware of the distinctions between Hindu Brahmins and Buddhist monks, and even described a Buddhist monastery. This indicates a significant intellectual engagement with and potential subtle influence from Indian philosophical traditions, even if not a direct doctrinal integration on the same level as his incorporation of astrology. A crucial distinction within Bardaisanite theology lies in the understanding of dualism. While the Bardaisanites are often categorized as a Gnostic sect, and Gnosticism generally implies dualistic cosmology, Bardaisan himself held a monistic view. He considered God to exist and evil not as a co-equal created entity, but rather as weakness and not in force. However, his followers, particularly after the rise of Manichaeism, radicalized his concept of darkness into an evil entity, leading to a dualistic interpretation that was then attributed to the Bardaisanites by later historical authors. This evolution of belief within the sect and the subsequent misrepresentation by opponents highlights the complex dynamics of theological development and the challenges of historical reconstruction. The theological positions adopted by Bardaisan, particularly his detailed arguments on fate and free will, demonstrate a profound engagement with the prevailing philosophical debates of his time, including Greek fatalism and Epicureanism. His integration of astrology into a Christian framework was not a simple adoption of pagan practices, but a sophisticated attempt to explain the problem of evil and human suffering within a monotheistic worldview. Furthermore, his belief in apokatastasis positions him within a broader, albeit minority, Christian theological tradition shared by other significant figures like Origen. These aspects reveal Bardaisan not merely as a heretic blindly adopting foreign ideas, but as a serious theologian and philosopher, grappling with fundamental questions of existence and divine justice using the intellectual tools available in his syncretic environment. His heresies were often sophisticated theological innovations, later rejected as Christian orthodoxy solidified. Bardaisan's stance on the resurrection of the body, denying a purely physical resurrection but affirming a spiritual transformation, aligns with some nuanced discussions within early Christian thought. For instance, modern scholarship debates whether the Apostle Paul's concept of a spiritual body implies a physical but transformed body, or a non-physical one, differing from the more corporeal portrayals in Luke and John. This parallel suggests that Bardaisan's position, while condemned by later orthodoxy, was not entirely outside the spectrum of early Christian theological discourse. It illustrates that what later became heresy was often a matter of emphasis or interpretation on doctrines that were still fluid and subject to considerable debate within the nascent Christian movement. The shadow of orthodoxy, condemnation and conflict. The historical trajectory of the Bardaisanites is inextricably linked to the dynamic and often contentious process by which early Christianity worked out its standard of orthodoxy. Gnosticism, in its various forms including Bardaisanism, represented a significant challenge to this emerging mainstream, threatening to fracture the nascent church by proposing alternative cosmologies and Christologies. The theological points of contention leading to the Bardaisanites' condemnation were numerous and fundamental. Bardaisan's cosmology, which posited creation from pre-existing, uncreated elements and an accidental mixture with darkness, directly contradicted the emerging orthodox doctrine of creatio ex nihilo, creation from nothing. This difference in understanding the very origin of the cosmos was a major point of criticism. Furthermore, while Bardaisan himself maintained a monistic view of evil as a weakness, the radicalization of the darkness concept by his followers into an active evil entity was perceived as a dualistic position, a significant departure from orthodox theology. The denial of a physical resurrection of the body and the inclination towards docetism, which suggested Christ only, appeared to have a material form, directly challenged core Christian doctrines of the Incarnation and the bodily resurrection of Jesus. Lastly, Bardaisan's active interest in astral fatalism, despite his arguments for free will, was viewed as an undue compromise with pagan beliefs and problematic within a Christian worldview. The theological disagreements manifested in fierce polemics. Saint Ephrem the Syriac, 306 to 373 CE, stands out as Bardaisan's most prominent and vocal opponent. Ephrem dedicated his life to combating Bardaisanism in Edessa, composing elaborate prose refutations and hymns specifically designed to counter Bardaisan's teachings, particularly his views on fate, free will, and the resurrection of the body. Ephrem is even credited with strategically using his own hymns to silence the unorthodox voices of the Bardaisanites, demonstrating the power of cultural and artistic forms in theological combat. It is important to note that Bardaisan himself engaged in these theological battles, writing dialogues against other contemporary figures like Marcion and Valentinus. This context reveals that the early Christian landscape was characterized by intense internal conflict among various Christian groups, each vying for theological legitimacy and influence, rather than a simple dichotomy between a fixed orthodoxy and isolated heresies. The writings of opponents like Ephrem, while invaluable for preserving knowledge of Bardaisan's doctrines, are inherently biased. They are fierce polemics, and often contain misrepresentations, rumors, and inaccuracies. Ephrem's stated goal was to construct a polarity between a jealous Satan and a loving God, and to argue that heresies, including Bardaisanism, were merely different manifestations of Satan's jealous attempt to hurt mankind. This rhetorical strategy means that the surviving accounts are not neutral historical records, but rather instruments designed to discredit and demonize. Consequently, historical interpretation requires careful deconstruction of these polemical layers to discern Bardaisan's actual beliefs from the caricatures presented by his adversaries. The condemnation of Bardaisanites was not solely a theological matter. It was deeply intertwined with the establishment of institutional authority and control within the nascent Christian church. The emerging proto-orthodox hierarchy systematically repressed Gnostic Christians, actively destroying their literature and declaring their doctrines heretical. Laws were enacted to forbid heretical teachers from propagating their doctrines, deny their children inheritance, and, in some cases, even make heresy a capital crime. This institutional suppression directly explains why so few of Bardaisan's original writings have survived. The church authorities were acutely aware of the power of cultural forms, such as music and poetry, and strategically employed them to silence unorthodox voices, as seen in Ephraim's efforts. This historical dynamic underscores that the theological debates of the early church were not abstract intellectual exercises, but existential struggles for religious dominance, where doctrinal purity was enforced through social, political, and institutional power. The fading light, disappearance, and legacy. The Bardaisanite sect, despite its initial prominence in Edessa and Mesopotamia, eventually faded from historical prominence, largely disappearing after the 6th century CE due to sustained condemnation by Orthodox Church authorities. User query. Several factors contributed to its decline and eventual absorption. Internally, the Bardaisanites were described as a rather heterogeneous group, suggesting a lack of cohesive internal structure or doctrinal unity that might have contributed to their fragmentation over time. Furthermore, while Bardaisan himself was monistic, his followers' radicalization of his doctrines, particularly the concept of darkness towards a dualistic interpretation, could have further alienated them from a consolidating orthodoxy that increasingly emphasized a singular, benevolent creator God. Externally, the relentless pressure from Orthodox authorities played a significant role in their demise. This included not only theological polemics, as seen in the vigorous campaigns of Saint Ephraim, but also direct institutional measures. For instance, Bishop Rabula of Edessa, d. 435, actively compelled Bardaisanites to conform to Orthodox doctrine. The broader systematic suppression of Gnostic groups, involving the destruction of their literature and the declaration of their beliefs as heresy, created an environment hostile to their continued existence. The disappearance of the Bardaisanites was not necessarily a complete erasure, but often a process of transformation and absorption into other, more dominant religious movements. Historical evidence suggests that Bardaisanism seems to have merged first into Valentinianism and subsequently into the widespread movement of Manichaeism. Mani, the founder of Manichaeism, explicitly sought to synthesize major religions of his time, presenting himself as an apostle of Jesus, and acknowledging figures like Buddha and Zoroaster as prophets. Manichaeism's pronounced dualistic worldview, which posited a cosmic struggle between forces of light and darkness, would have found a natural resonance with those Bardaisanites who had already radicalized Bardaisan's cosmology towards a more dualistic understanding of evil. This process illustrates that religious ideas, even those deemed heretical, do not always simply vanish, but can evolve and find new forms within other religious frameworks, demonstrating the resilience and adaptability of theological concepts. Despite their official condemnation and eventual disappearance as a distinct sect, Bardaisan's intellectual contributions had a long trajectory of influence. His anti-deterministic arguments, in particular, were appreciated and adapted by subsequent authors, even by those who otherwise denigrated his views. His innovative Syriac hymns left a lasting mark on the development of Syriac poetry and music. Furthermore, his teachings are reported to have formed a basis for later movements, including Manichaeism and certain Batini sects of Shia Islam. His memory, remarkably, was kept alive by friend and foe alike, with some early Christian figures like Julius Africanus, Eusebius of Caesarea, Didymus the Blind, and Jerome expressing a surprisingly amicable attitude towards him despite their theological differences. This persistence of his ideas, even in the absence of his sect, highlights the complex and often unacknowledged flow of intellectual currents throughout history, where figures deemed heretical can still contribute to the development of the very traditions that condemned them, albeit often subtly or indirectly. Conclusion: the enduring mystery. The story of the Bardaisanites, a Gnostic sect founded by the polymath Bardaisan of Edessa, offers a profound glimpse into the tumultuous and intellectually vibrant landscape of early Christianity. From his influential role in Christianizing Edessa and his sophisticated philosophical explorations of free will, fate, and cosmology, to the eventual suppression of his followers by an emerging orthodoxy, the narrative of the Bardaisanites is one of innovation, conflict, and eventual assimilation. Their disappearance was not an absolute erasure, but a complex process of doctrinal evolution, external pressure, and absorption into larger, more syncretic movements like Manichaeism. The scarcity of direct historical records, particularly the near-total loss of Bardaisan's own writings save for the indirect Book of the Laws of the countries, underscores the profound impact of power dynamics on historical narratives. The systematic efforts of proto-Orthodox authorities to suppress and discredit dissenting voices mean that the surviving accounts are often polemical, requiring careful critical analysis to reconstruct the true nature of Bardaisan's thought. This historical reality serves as a powerful reminder that truth in early Christian history was not a static, monolithic entity, but a contested space shaped by intense theological, social, and institutional struggles. Despite their official condemnation and the fading of their distinct identity, the intellectual contributions of Bardaisan persisted, subtly influencing later theological and philosophical currents. His arguments, particularly on free will and his unique synthesis of Christian thought with astrology, found echoes even among his detractors. The Bardaisanites, therefore, represent more than just a vanished cult. They embody a crucial chapter in the diverse and often tumultuous history of early Christianity, demonstrating how religious ideas evolve, adapt, and sometimes endure in transmuted forms. Uncovering these forgotten narratives through deep research is essential not only for historical accuracy, but also for understanding the complex interplay of faith, philosophy, and power that shaped the religious landscape of the ancient world and continues to resonate today.